The calm before the storm. It was a quiet morning, much like any other in my peaceful neighborhood. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my drink and watching the sun rise over the quiet streets. Life was simple here, tucked away in a place where everyone knew each other and the rules, though numerous, were generally harmless. But that morning, things were about to change in a way that none of us could have predicted. The community I had called home for years was about to be thrown into chaos, thanks to a group of self-appointed enforcers with too much time on their hands and too little sense of responsibility. These so-called HOA police thought they had the right to impose their will upon everyone. They were supposed to keep the peace, but instead, they were stirring up trouble where there was none. And the worst part? They thought they could mess with the wrong person. It all started when I saw them standing outside my front door, a group of 4 individuals wearing matching polo shirts and trying desperately to project an air of authority they simply didn't possess. From the looks of them, they seemed more like extras from a B-grade cop movie than actual enforcement officers. One of them held a plastic badge with all the enthusiasm of a kid playing pretend in his backyard. And yet, they were here, ready to arrest me over trivial matters that wouldn't have warranted a second glance anywhere else. At first, I thought this had to be some sort of prank. But the more they spoke, the more I realized they were dead serious. This wasn't just a silly misunderstanding. They were here to enforce their absurd HOA rules, even going so far as to threaten me with detention for things like the color of my garage and an unregistered vehicle that was perfectly legal. I had been the subject of their petty complaints before, but this was something else entirely. They didn't realize, of course, that they were messing with the wrong guy. Not only had I been a resident of this neighborhood for years, but I was also more familiar with law enforcement than they could ever imagine. I wasn't just some unsuspecting civilian. I was the real sheriff. I had a badge, a gun, and a deep understanding of what it meant to defend your home and rights. As I stepped outside to meet the HOA enforcers, I had a decision to make. I could either back down, let them impose their ridiculous rules on me, or I could stand my ground and fight back. The thought of allowing these imposter enforcers to continue their reign of terror was unbearable. I had dealt with entitled individuals before, but this was a whole new level of ridiculousness. And so, as they continued their absurd threats, I decided to play along. I smiled, showed them my badge, and watched their confidence evaporate before my eyes. In an instant, the situation went from one of impending injustice to one where I was now in control. They had no idea what they were up against. But this wasn't going to be a quick victory. As Karen, the self-righteous leader of this ragtag group, turned to leave, I knew this wouldn't be the last time she and her cronies tried to flex their fake authority. No, they weren't done yet. They would come back, more determined than ever to take me down. And when they did, I would be ready. It was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. What followed was a series of petty, vindictive attempts to get me to comply. The HOA didn't just give up, they doubled down. First, they went after my garbage cans, then my parking space, and even my right to park in my own garage. I thought I had seen it all, but these people were truly determined to make my life miserable. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated me. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and I was about to make sure they learned that the hard way. Escalation, a battle of wits and power. After the confrontation at my doorstep, I knew it was only the beginning. Karen and her absurd enforcers thought they could simply bully me into submission. But that wasn't how this would play out. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them run roughshod over my property and my rights. The town marshal didn't back down, especially not from a group of fake officers with delusions of grandeur. The next few days were filled with petty retaliation. Karen had a chip on her shoulder, and she wanted to make sure I felt every ounce of her anger. But she was about to learn that not only was I unafraid, I was prepared. The first move, the missing garbage cans. The first sign that Karen wasn't done with me came the following morning. I went to take out the garbage, as I did every Tuesday. But to my surprise, my garbage cans were gone. Not just moved, completely disappeared. I stood there in disbelief, staring at the empty space where they had always been. And then I saw her, across the street, arms crossed, wearing that smug little smile. Karen. She made sure to give me a look of satisfaction, like she'd won a battle. I had half a mind to march over there and confront her, but I knew better. I wasn't going to let her bait me into a reaction. Instead, I walked to my mailbox, hoping there was some sign or explanation for this ridiculous move. As I opened it, I found a letter, stamped with the HOA logo. I already knew what it was going to be. Sure enough, it was a list of penalties. You are no longer allowed to use the waste disposal services. You are not permitted to park your car in the garage and must attend a mandatory HOA meeting to discuss your inappropriate behavior. I couldn't help but laugh. I tore the letter in half, letting the pieces fall to the ground. If Karen thought that a piece of paper could scare me, she had another thing coming. It was almost laughable. I wasn't going to bend to her petty games. But as I walked back to my house, I knew this wasn't over. Karen was relentless, and I had a feeling this was just the beginning of her little war. She'd escalate, and I had to be ready for it. The next move, the cone and the closed garage. And escalate she did. The very next day, I walked outside to find an orange cone blocking my driveway. Along with it was a laminated notice stuck to a piece of wood. It read, "Garage closed by order of the HOA." Closed. How could anyone possibly have the audacity to close my garage? It was my property. I walked over, ripped the paper off, and tossed the cone aside like it was a toy. But as I turned, I saw two of Karen's cronies standing across the street, writing in their little notebooks like they were real investigators. The scene felt like a bad sitcom. I was ready to ignore it and go about my day, but before I could walk back into the house, Karen appeared, like a storm cloud on a sunny day. "You can't remove that," she ordered, pointing to the cone as though it were the most important thing in the world. "Oh, can't I?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "In my own house?" She started shouting about the HOA's authority over community rules and how I couldn't just ignore them. The absurdity of it all made my blood boil, but I stayed calm. "Karen, you don't have the authority to ban my garage. In fact, you have no authority over anything. You're just trying to annoy me, and it's not going to work." Her face turned red as a tomato. She had nothing to say to that. I turned on my heel and walked back inside, slamming the door behind me for good measure. I knew it wasn't over, though. This was just her latest attempt to push my buttons. But I wouldn't let her win. The final straw, a false report to the police. The next day, as I was heading to the police station for work, I got a call from a neighbor. They said that the police were outside my house. I stopped dead in my tracks. Why in the world would the police be at my house? I rushed home, only to find two officers speaking with Karen, who was acting all innocent, like a concerned neighbor reporting something dangerous. I walked up to them, and immediately the officers recognized me. They knew me. I wasn't just a regular resident. I was the town marshal. One of the officers gave me a sympathetic smile. We got a report about a man with a gun on your property," he said, clearly uncomfortable. I raised an eyebrow. "And I'm sure that report came from Karen, right?" Karen's eyes widened. She tried to play it off, but she knew she'd been caught. The officers, already fed up, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "Well, since there's no real threat, we'll mark it as a prank," one officer said. "But Miss Karen, for the record, making false reports like this can get you into serious trouble." For the first time, I saw Karen's arrogance crack. Her face turned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the officers had already started walking away, ignoring her. This was a small win, but I knew Karen wouldn't give up that easily. She had a vendetta now, and she was going to make me pay for ruining her little plans. But what she didn't know was that the real battle was only just beginning. More dirty tricks. Karen's ridiculous attempts to assert authority over my property didn't stop there. Every time she made a move, I was one step ahead. From fake inspection reports to more fabricated complaints, she thought she could wear me down. But what she didn't understand was that I was playing the long game, and my patience was paying off. The final confrontation, how the tables turned. By now, Karen had pulled every dirty trick she could think of. She thought she could wear me down, break my spirit, or maybe even force me out of my home. But one thing Karen didn't count on was my experience, my resolve, and my patience. I had spent years working as a law enforcement officer, and I was no stranger to dealing with difficult and stubborn people. But Karen, she was on a whole new level. The HOA had already been embarrassed twice, but I knew they weren't ready to give up just yet. She still had a few tricks up her sleeve, and as long as she thought she had some form of power over me, she was going to use it. The escalation, the fake water leak. The next morning, I was woken up by the rumble of a truck in front of my house. Still half asleep, I walked over to the window to find a team of workers in uniform unloading excavators, shovels, and cones. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it must be a mistake. Was there something wrong with the plumbing? But then I noticed Karen standing on the other side of the street, her arms crossed, a smug grin on her face. This wasn't an accident. This was Karen's doing. I opened the door, still in my pajamas, and walked over to one of the workers. He turned to face me, clipboard in hand, and said, "Good morning, sir. We're here to begin repairs on the underground pipes. There's a reported water leak." A water leak? I was confused. My house had no such issue. I asked him, "Who reported this? Is this the right address?" He flipped through his papers and confirmed, "Yes. The order came from Karen Thompson, president of the HOA." Of course, this was Karen's latest scheme. Make up a non-existent problem and have it fixed by contractors, all to cause more hassle and stress for me. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "There's no water leak here. Neither you nor the HOA has the authority to dig up my yard. Please pack your things and leave." The worker hesitated. I could see the confusion in his face, but I wasn't backing down. I showed him my badge, and the effect was immediate. His eyes widened, and he quickly turned to his crew, telling them to pack up and leave. As Karen came marching toward me, looking like a storm ready to burst, I couldn't help but smile inwardly. I knew this was going to be a victory. When Karen reached me, she tried to argue, saying that the HOA had authority over the neighborhood infrastructure. "You can't just stop the repairs," she yelled. I simply crossed my arms and lowered my voice. "Actually, Karen, I have the authority to arrest you for trespassing and fraud. You and your team are illegally attempting to tamper with my property. This ends now." For the first time, Karen was speechless. She looked like she had just been caught red-handed. Her usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. After a long, awkward pause, she huffed and walked away, muttering something about me not respecting the community. But I had won, and I knew that was one battle in a much larger war. The HOA's retaliation, a final attempt. It didn't take long before Karen found her next move. The HOA had failed in every attempt to intimidate me, so they decided to play their last card, the threat of eviction. I woke up to find a letter from the HOA, claiming that my behavior was harming the community and that they were initiating disciplinary actions to remove me from my home. The letter was filled with vague accusations. Something about a violation of community standards, disregarding authority, and causing issues for my neighbors. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. The idea that they could force me out of my house was laughable. The HOA had no power over my property or my mortgage. They had no legal right to remove me from my home. But Karen had convinced herself that she had the upper hand. The letter was a mere formality. It was Karen's way of continuing the psychological warfare. She wanted to make me feel powerless, but what she didn't realize was that I was far from powerless. If anything, I was more determined than ever to fight back. The HOA meeting, a public showdown. The real showdown came when the HOA scheduled a public meeting to discuss the alleged problems with my behavior. The room was packed with residents, all sitting like they were attending a courtroom hearing. The air was thick with tension, and at the front, Karen sat smugly with a stack of papers in front of her. She thought she had me cornered, but she couldn't have been more wrong. As the meeting began, Karen took the floor with a dramatic sigh, addressing the residents as if they were children. "We're here today to discuss the highly problematic behavior of one of our residents who refuses to cooperate with community standards," she began, trying to sound authoritative. Couldn't help it. I raised my hand and interrupted her. "Cut the nonsense, Karen. You don't get to decide who stays in this community. You're not the sheriff. You don't have the power to evict anyone here." Her face turned crimson. She stammered but continued, trying to convince the neighbors that I was a troublemaker and a bad influence on the community. But it was clear that the tide was turning. Residents were beginning to look at her differently. They were starting to see the manipulation and the lies. I calmly crossed my arms and added, "This meeting means nothing. The HOA has no power to remove me. If you really want to kick me out, you'll have to take it up with the law, and we both know that's not going to happen." The silence in the room was deafening. Karen opened her mouth to argue but realized she had nothing left to say. The once powerful president of the HOA had been publicly humiliated, and she knew it. The fallout, the beginning of the end for Karen. The weeks following the meeting were a whirlwind of events. Karen tried to keep her grip on the HOA, but her power had slipped away. The residents who had once followed her blindly began to realize the truth. They had been manipulated by someone with a false sense of superiority. I filed a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and misuse of resources. The complaint was taken seriously, and an investigation was launched. It didn't take long for the county to uncover that Karen had been using the HOA's power to bully residents and raise money for her own personal gain. She had also been involved in shady dealings with contractors and had embezzled funds from the HOA. The final blow came when it was revealed that Karen had been operating illegally for years, never even holding proper elections for the HOA board. She had stayed in power because no one had bothered to challenge her, until now. When the police arrived to remove her from office, Karen was escorted out like a criminal. It was a fitting end to her reign of terror. The aftermath, peace returns. With Karen gone, the HOA underwent a major overhaul. The rules were loosened, unfair fines were abolished, and the new board made sure that no one would ever have absolute power over the residents again. It was a victory not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Karen's influence was gone, and peace returned. It was a hard-fought battle, but one that was worth every moment. I had stood my ground, defended my rights, and exposed the truth. In the end, the residents who had once feared Karen now realized that standing up for what's right wasn't just possible. It was necessary. And as for Karen, well, I heard she tried to appeal the whole situation in court, but that went nowhere. She had to sell her house and move out of town. The neighborhood was finally free from her tyranny, and I was able to enjoy my home again. Final thoughts, the power of standing your ground. This entire ordeal taught me something important. It taught me that when you stand up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds, you can make a difference. It's not about being the loudest person in the room. It's about having the courage to fight for what you believe in. The lesson here is simple. Never let anyone, whether it's a fake HOA president or an entitled neighbor, trample over your rights. Stand firm, stay calm, and know that you have the power to fight back. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and want more stories of justice, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, the truth always wins in the end.